Hi everyone, so today we're going to be going over an overview of the performance task part of the SBAC math test. So the performance task section is separate from the computer adaptive section of the test. Make a note on your papers for this one that you're going to be taking the performance task first when you take the test on Monday. The performance task requires you to solve one multi-step real-world problem. Each part or each step of the problem can involve different types of questions. So there might be part of it where you have to create an equation, part of it where you have to describe your answer, part of it where you have to make a graph, etc. Although it varies, it usually takes students around an hour to an hour and a half to complete the performance task. And then a last note for this one is that your responses are scored by people. So there's going to be a person who's trained to grade these items. They use a rubric to help them decide how many points to give you for each part of the question. And then once your performance task is scored, it's combined with your computer adaptive score to give you your overall score on the test. So the notes today are a little bit different. We're going to be going through and doing this performance task together. We're going to be looking at the rubric, and then we're going to be looking at a total of 7 different student responses to see who got all the points, who got some of the points, and who got none of the points for their answers for this one part of this question. So this performance task question says the graphs of 3 quadratic functions f, g, and h of x are shown below. And so here the 3 functions are typed out for you. And then over here, the 3 functions are graphed for you. Your job on this problem is to match the 3 functions with their graphs and make sure that you include all work and or reasoning necessary to support your answer. So before you move on in the presentation, take a minute, pause on this slide, see if you can match them up. You have 3 equations that are given to you in different forms. So take a minute, pause here, see if you can match these up. Which one does f of x go with, which one does g of x go with, and which one does h of x go with, given the 3 graphs over here, a, b, and c. So this goes through the rubric for this example question from a performance task. In order to get both points on the question, you have to match all 3 parabolas correctly, and you have to give reasons for at least 2 of the parabolas. There's a note made here. You can use process of elimination as your reasoning for matching the last one to its answer. To get half of the points, so to get 1 out of 2 points on the question, you would match either all 3, 2, or 1 of the parabolas correctly with appropriate justification for at least one of them. So it says here that as long as you match one of them correctly and provide a correct reason for that one that you match correctly, you can still get 1 out of the 2 points for the question. If you don't provide any appropriate justification for the matches, then even if you get all 3 of them matched correctly, you don't get any points for the question. There's a couple more notes that are included on this slide. Matching all 3 of them correctly does not guarantee that you get both possible points, so you have to make sure that you explain your answers to the question. Also, it says there's many ways that you can answer the question, and so it's okay to use different reasons to get the right answer to the question. Make a note on the lines for this one to remind yourself that you should always attempt the question, even if you're not sure if you have the answer right. You could still get partial points on this question, even if you can only match one of the parabolas correctly, but if you're not sure how to match all of them, still do your best because you can get partial points. This slide here also contains the correct answer to the question. And so if you tried it on the previous screen, so A goes with f of x, B goes with h of x, and C goes with g of x. All right, so now we're going to briefly look at 7 different students' answers to these questions. And so the part that's typed here in the box in white is the answer that the student typed. The score is given on the bottom in green, so that's whether the student got a 2, a 1, or a 0. So let's take a look at this one. This student said that f of x had a vertex at -1.3, 1.18 because that first equation was in vertex form. And so it says that out of the 3 choices, the only parabola that could have that vertex is graph A. So they matched graph A correctly, and they gave a valid reason. They then went on to say that they know that since h of x is factored, it says that the only parabola that fits that description is graph B. And then the last thing that they said is that this leaves g of x to match with graph C, and then they went through and actually gave a reason for it. So technically they didn't need to include the reason for the third one because process of elimination would have been sufficient, but they decided to provide that answer. They don't get extra points for doing that. As a matter of fact, you want to make sure that it's correct, because if that description for the third one was wrong, then they would get knocked down to just getting 1 out of the 2 points instead of both of them. The student also summarized their responses here. And so for the rubric for this one, it says this student would score a 2. They matched all 3 functions to their graphs correctly, and they provided valid mathematical reasoning for each match. Here's a second student response that we'll take a look at. So this student said since f of x has a y-intercept at 3.039 and g of x has a y-intercept at 3, they can reason that f of x has to have a greater y-intercept than g of x, and so they can use that to match those. They can use that to match f of x and g of x. And so then the students summarized their answers. So they summarized their match here. This response also scores a 2, but there's a couple of things in this answer that I wanted to point out to you. The student in this problem made spelling errors. The student in this problem also misspoke when they said that it meant that the graph of f of x would have the highest point on the x-axis. They meant to say y-axis here. But in this response, it was scored a 2 because it said that that error here was considered a minor flaw that did not detract from the responses that demonstrated full understanding. Notice that on this one as well, they used process of elimination to determine the match for graph B, and that's okay. So the directions to the question said that you had to provide justification for at least 2 of your matches, so you didn't need to have a reason that the third one would match. Make a note on the lines for this one that things like spelling errors or minor mathematical misunderstandings do not mean that you are necessarily going to lose points on the question. All right, looking at this third student response, they said that h of x had to match with graph B because it was the only equation that had a -0. They then said that f of x had to match with graph A because it was a left shift and A was the only one that had a left shift. And then they said that g of x had to be graph C because it's shifting to the right and because of process of elimination. And so this student scored a 2 on this question. The description of their work here points out that saying that g of x shifts to the right is insufficient. You can't tell that just by looking at the equation. However, it is not incorrect because it does shift to the right. It's just not, you can't tell that from the way the equation is written. But however, you see where they said process of elimination. And so process of elimination for the last match is a valid method and earns full credit. So make a note on the lines for this one that for this question, you only had to provide justification for 2 out of the 3 matches according to the rubric. The next set of student responses, so responses 4 through 7, all provide answers to the question where the students did not receive full credit. And so you can see here on this one that this student earns only 1 out of the possible 2 points for the question. For the first one, it says that they noticed that it's a left shift, and so that matches graph A with f of x, and so that's correct. However, on the second and third part of their answers to this question, they make errors. So even though they matched h of x correctly with B and they matched g of x correctly with C, they didn't provide correct mathematical justification for either of those 2 answer choices. And so their score on this one would be a 1 out of 2. Here's another response that scored less than a 2. On this one, all 3 of the graphs are matched correctly. The description for this one indicates that their reason for g of x matching with C is incorrect. The justification for graph C has an error because the y value when x equals 0 is positive, not negative, so this part is incorrect. The student could have used process of elimination to match G, and if they had said g of x matches with C because that's the only one that's left because of process of elimination, they would have scored a 2 on this question. Because they decided to provide justification for g of x matching with C, their justification happened to be incorrect, and so it dropped them down from a 2 to a 1. So you want to be careful with over-explaining things sometimes, especially if you're not sure if something's correct. You might want to limit your response to the parts of it that you know to be true because you don't want to end up losing yourself points later on. On this 6th response, the student scores 1. All 3 functions are matched correctly. However, only one of them has complete justification, and that's the one for h of x. Because in h of x is written in intercept form, so there's 1 positive and 1 negative root, so their justification for h of x is correct. The justification for f of x is incorrect, and because of that, the student cannot use common sense or a process of elimination to match g of x with graph C, and so they would score a 1 on this question according to the rubric. And then here we also wanted to provide an example of a student response that got 0 out of the possible 2 points. So on this one, the student does correctly identify that graph B has to match with h of x. However, the reasoning that they provide for that is insufficient. And then on this example, the student matched graphs A and C incorrectly. And so down here in the description, it says the omissions and irregularities indicate a lack of comprehension. Insufficient evidence is present, and so therefore the response earns no credit. So we wanted to finish today with some tips for approaching performance tasks. We're going to practice a performance task together later in the week, but here are some things to keep in mind when you're doing the performance task part of the SBAC math test when you take it next Monday. So first, read the whole question. Make sure that you answer every part of the question step by step. A lot of the times when students lose points on these questions, it's not because they're doing the math wrong, it's because they forget to answer part of the question. Be sure when it's required that you justify your answers mathematically. Also keep in mind that a lot of these math problems are math problems from math that you've learned before this year. So it doesn't necessarily have to be math that you're doing that's math that we learned about this year. You want to make sure too that you remember that a lot of these questions have more than one way of getting the answer right. And so it's your job to explain your reason for your work being correct. And then it was so important that we put it on here twice. When you think you're done answering the question, reread the question to make sure you've answered every part of the question. Go ahead and make a note on this one that students commonly lose points for not answering all parts of the question. I really want that to be your takeaway for today.